You are listening to When Violet Blooms, Chapter 1, The Guardian Angel. The final notes of Violet's violin lingered in the concert hall like a prayer ascending to heaven. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lowered the instrument, the applause washing over her in waves that felt both overwhelming and hollow. Behind the stage lights, she could see the familiar faces of the elite, her father's business associates, their wives adorned in diamonds that caught the light like captured stars, their children who attended these events more out of obligation than genuine appreciation for music. As she took her bow, Violet's eyes searched the crowd for her father. There he was, in the third row, already checking his phone. The sight sent a familiar pang through her chest. Even her performances, the one thing that brought her pure joy, couldn't hold his attention for long. "Miss Violet, your driver is waiting," her usual bodyguard Marcus would have said. But Marcus wasn't here tonight. Instead, a woman in a crisp black suit stood near the stage exit, her posture military straight, dark hair pulled back in a neat half-up style. This was Alina, her temporary replacement. Violet had only met her briefly that morning. The security company had sent Alina with impressive credentials. Former military, specialized in personal protection, impeccable record. But what struck Violet most wasn't Alina's qualifications, it was her eyes. Cold, distant, professional. Like looking into still water that reflected everything but revealed nothing beneath. "Miss Violet?" The voice was low, controlled. Alina approached with measured steps, her combat boots silent against the polished floor. "Your father asked me to escort you home." Violet nodded, then paused. Through the tall windows of the concert hall, she could see the city beyond, lights twinkling like earthbound constellations. People walking freely down sidewalks she'd only glimpsed from behind tinted car windows. A sudden, desperate longing seized her. "Actually," Violet said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "could you tell the driver to go ahead? I'm meeting some friends for dinner. I'll make my own way home later." It was a lie, of course. She had no friends, not real ones. The girls who sometimes invited her to their gatherings did so because of her father's connections. Their laughter too bright, their compliments too practiced. But Alina didn't need to know that. Alina's expression didn't change, but Violet caught a flicker of something concern. Suspicion? In those dark eyes. "I'll accompany you, Miss Violet." "Of course," Violet murmured, though part of her had hoped for a different response. She'd never walked alone through the city, never felt the freedom of being just another person among thousands. The evening air was crisp against her skin as they stepped outside. Violet had changed from her concert gown into a simple lavender dress that complemented her violet hair, but she still felt overdressed, too polished for the casual world she longed to experience. She began walking not toward any particular destination, but simply away from the concert hall, away from the waiting cars and the watching eyes of her father's world. Behind her, she could sense Alina following at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to maintain the illusion of privacy. This is what normal feels like, Violet thought as she breathed in the city air, tinged with the scent of street food and car exhaust and something indefinably alive. This is what I've been missing. Her steps slowed as she passed a small park where a family was gathered around a bench. A little girl, no more than 6, clutched a cloud of pink cotton candy in her small fist, while her parents watched her with indulgent smiles. The child's laughter was pure music, more genuine than any applause Violet had ever received. Violet found herself smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes. When had she last felt such uncomplicated joy? When had anyone looked at her the way those parents looked at their daughter, with unconditional love rather than expectation? The memory of her mother flickered through her mind, gentle hands guiding, Her small fingers across violin strings, a voice like honey humming lullabies, the scent of violets from the garden they tended together. That those memories were fading, becoming more precious and more painful with each passing year. Further down the street, a group of teenage girls walked past, their arms linked, their conversation punctuated by bursts of genuine laughter. They wore simple clothes, jeans, sneakers, cheerful sweaters, and they moved through the world with an ease Violet envied. They belonged to each other, belonged to this world in a way she never had. I don't have even one real friend, the thought hit her with sudden, sharp clarity. All her relationships were transactions, performances, carefully choreographed interactions that served someone else's purpose. She belonged to no one, and no one truly belonged to her, despite her wealth and status. Lost in her melancholy, Violet didn't notice how the crowds had thinned, how the cheerful lights of the main street had given way to the dimmer glow of a more isolated area. She was thinking about loneliness, about the gilded cage of her life, when the black car pulled up to the curb. Everything happened so fast. Two men emerged from the vehicle, their faces hard, their movements purposeful. They reached for her before she could react, their hands rough against her arms. No! The word tore from her throat as she struggled, her violin case clattering to the pavement. One of the men was trying to drag her toward the open car door while the other kept watch. Panic flooded her system, making her movements clumsy, desperate. Then, like a force of nature, Alina was there. Violet had never seen anyone move like that. Fluid, precise, deadly. The first attacker went down before he knew what hit him. The second barely had time to register the threat before Alina's fist connected with his solar plexus, dropping him to his knees. Two more men emerged from the car, and suddenly Alina was facing 4 opponents. But she moved like a dancer in perfect control, each strike precise, each dodge effortless. This wasn't the stiff, formal bodyguard who had stood by the concert hall exit. This was a warrior, someone who had learned to fight not in a gym, but in places where fighting meant survival. The attackers, clearly unprepared for such resistance, made a swift decision to retreat. They dragged their fallen comrades back to the car and sped away, leaving Violet shaking on the sidewalk. "Are you hurt?" Alina's voice was steady, professional, but Violet caught the underlying tension. "Can you walk?" Violet nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her legs weak and her hands trembling. She watched as Alina retrieved her violin case, checking it for damage with the same careful attention she'd shown everything else. "We need to get you home," Alina said, already pulling out her phone to call a taxi. "Your father will need to be informed." "Wait." Violet's voice was smaller than she intended. She looked at Alina, really looked at her for the first time. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, blood seeping from split knuckles, and her usually perfect posture was slightly favored to one side. "You're hurt. We should go to the hospital." "It's nothing," Alina replied, her tone flat. The taxi arrived, and the ride home passed in tense silence. Violet kept stealing glances at her protector, noting the way Alina held herself, rigid, controlled, as if showing pain would be admitting weakness. But Violet could see past the facade. She'd spent her life reading people, understanding the difference between genuine emotion and performance. Alina was hurt, probably more than she was letting on. The moment they entered the grand foyer of the mansion, Violet was in motion. She rushed to the first aid kit in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she gathered supplies. When she returned to the living room, Alina was standing exactly where she'd left her, straight-backed and stoic like a soldier awaiting orders. Without a word, Violet took Alina's hand and gently pulled her toward the sofa. Alina complied, though her posture remained rigid. Violet sat beside her, the first aid kit open between them. Up close, she could see the full extent of the damage, scraped knuckles, a purpling bruise along Alina's jaw, that cut above her eyebrow that was deeper than it had first appeared. "This is my fault," Violet whispered as she dampened a cotton pad with antiseptic. "If I hadn't decided to walk home, if I had just gone straight to the car like I was supposed to." "Don't." Alina's voice was sharp, then softer. "This isn't your fault." Violet's hands trembled as she cleaned the cut on Alina's forehead. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her eyes filling with tears she couldn't stop. "I'm so sorry." Alina went very still. In all her years of protection work, she'd been injured countless times. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulders, cuts and bruises that were simply part of the job. Her previous clients had barely acknowledged her injuries, viewing them as expected consequences of the service they paid for. She was a tool, a shield, expendable. But Violet was crying. For her, because of her. At this distance, Alina could smell the subtle fragrance that clung to Violet's skin. Not the expensive perfume she'd expected, but something gentler, like flowers after rain. She could feel the warmth of Violet's breath, see the way her purple hair caught the lamplight, notice the delicate arch of her eyebrows as she concentrated on her task. Violet's touch was impossibly gentle, as if she were afraid of causing more pain. Each careful dab of antiseptic, each tender press of gauze, sent unexpected warmth through Alina's chest. She found herself studying Violet's face, the genuine concern in those expressive eyes, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, the slight flush in her cheeks that spoke of real emotion rather than polite sympathy. "She's so beautiful." The thought came unbidden, and Alina quickly looked away, focusing on a point somewhere beyond Violet's shoulder. This was dangerous territory. She was here to do a job, nothing more. In 4 weeks, she'd be gone, and Violet would return to her world of galas and concerts and carefully managed relationships. But the warmth of Violet's hands, the soft murmur of her apologies, the way she treated Alina's injuries as if they mattered, as if she mattered, was awakening something Alina had thought she'd buried long ago. "There," Violet said softly. "How does that feel?" "Fine," Alina managed, though her voice sounded rougher than intended. "Thank you." Their eyes met for a moment, and Alina saw something in Violet's gaze that made her chest tighten. She had been injured countless times before, some wounds far worse than this, but no one had ever cared about the scrapes on her hands like Violet did. Especially not someone like Violet. Violet was unlike any heiress Alina had protected. There was no arrogance in her, no distant coldness, none of that patronizing kindness that came with status. Her gentleness wasn't calculated or performative. It was simply who she was. Quiet, unassuming, like music drifting through a rainy night. And somehow, that unsettled Alina more than any blade ever had. She had long since learned to lock away her emotions in the field, during lonely night watches, under the weight of stares that saw her as nothing more than a weapon with a heartbeat. But now, under the soft glow of the chandelier, with Violet looking at her like she mattered, with trembling hands treating every bruise like something precious, Alina felt the armor around her heart begin to crack. She could still feel the warmth of Violet's touch lingering on her skin, the hesitant, delicate way she had cared for her, as if every movement whispered, "You're not just useful, you're worth something." And Alina didn't know what frightened her more, the thought of how vulnerable that made her feel, or how much she didn't want that warmth to go away. Chapter 2. Memories in violet. The first rays of dawn painted the mansion's kitchen in shades of gold and amber. Violet stood at the marble counter, her movements deliberate and graceful as she whisked eggs in a ceramic bowl. The kitchen, despite its grand proportions and professional-grade appliances, felt intimate in the early morning light. Steam rose gently from the kettle, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. She had woken before her usual time, unable to shake the memory of the previous night. The attack, the fear, but most vividly, Alina's fierce protection and the gentle way she had accepted Violet's care afterward. Something had shifted between them in those quiet moments on the sofa. Something that made Violet's heart flutter with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Cooking had always been her refuge. While the mansion employed a full kitchen staff, Violet found solace in the simple act of preparing meals with her own hands. It connected her to memories of her mother, who had taught her that food prepared with love carried a special kind of nourishment, one that fed the soul as much as the body. She arranged 3 place settings at the breakfast table with particular care. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the delicate china, casting dancing shadows across the white tablecloth. Everything had to be perfect. This wasn't just breakfast. It was her way of showing gratitude, of extending warmth to someone who had risked everything for her safety. Alina stood near the kitchen entrance, observing with the quiet attention that had become second nature. She watched Violet move with practiced grace, the way she flipped eggs with careful precision, the gentle hum that escaped her lips as she worked. There was something almost meditative about Violet's morning routine, a peacefulness that seemed at odds with the opulent grandeur of the mansion. This was unexpected. In Alina's experience, wealthy clients didn't prepare their own meals. They had staff for that, people whose job it was to anticipate every need. Yet here was Violet, cooking with the focused attention she might give to a complex musical passage. Her simple cream dress covered by an apron patterned with delicate violet flowers. The sound of footsteps on marble announced her father's arrival. He swept into the kitchen already dressed for business, moving with the efficient stride of someone perpetually in motion. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, pressing a quick kiss to Violet's forehead. Violet's face brightened with hope. "I made breakfast. Won't you sit for just a moment?" He was already checking his watch. "I'm sorry, darling. Already running late for my flight." "Love you," he called over his shoulder. And then he was gone, leaving only the echo of his departure. Violet stood motionless, her smile fading as the silence settled around her. The kitchen felt larger somehow, emptier, despite the warm morning light that continued to stream through the windows. This was the pattern of her life. Carefully prepared gestures of love that went unnoticed in the rush of more important things. She turned, noticing Alina properly for the first time that morning. "Good morning," she said. Something softened in her expression. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Alina replied, though the slight stiffness in her movements suggested otherwise. The previous night's injuries were clearly making themselves known. "Would you like to join me?" Violet asked. Alina hesitated. Her training had taught her to maintain professional boundaries, to be present but not intrusive, protective but not familiar. Yet something about Violet's expression, the way her shoulders had drooped when her father left, the careful brightness in her voice that couldn't quite mask her disappointment, made those boundaries seem less important than they had yesterday. Alina stepped forward, almost cautiously, and pulled out a chair for Violet. Violet blinked in surprise, then broke into a genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you," she said, settling into the chair with a grace that seemed as natural as breathing. Alina took the seat across from her, noting how the morning light caught the purple highlights in Violet's hair, making them shimmer like amethyst. The breakfast was simple but elegant. Perfectly scrambled eggs, golden toast, grilled tomatoes that still held their warmth. It was the kind of meal that spoke of care and attention, of someone who understood that love could be expressed through the simplest acts. "You're quite the chef," Alina said after taking her first bite. The eggs were creamy and seasoned with just a hint of herbs, the toast crisp and buttered to perfection. Violet's pleasure at the compliment was unmistakable. "I'm glad you enjoy it. I learned from my mother. She used to say that cooking was like music. It required patience, timing, and a willingness to put a little of your soul into every note." When Alina finished her portion, she glanced at the third plate, the one that had been set for Violet's father. "May I?" Alina gestured toward the untouched third plate. "Of course," Violet said, and her face lit up with quiet joy as she watched Alina start on the second helping. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing someone genuinely enjoy food she had prepared, about knowing that her efforts weren't going to waste. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the morning light shifting and dancing across the table between them. Alina found herself studying Violet's face when she thought Violet wasn't looking, noting the delicate curve of her jaw, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks when she looked down at her plate. After breakfast, Violet led Alina outside to the side garden. The space was a testament to careful cultivation, beds of violet flowers in every shade from deep purple to pale lavender, arranged with an artist's eye for color and form. The morning sun had burned off the last of the dew, and the air was filled with the sweet, subtle fragrance of the blooms. "This was my mother's garden," Violet said, picking up a copper watering can that had been worn smooth by years of use. "She planted the first violets when I was born, and every year she would add more. She used to say that violet flowers were like true love, modest and unassuming, but with roots that ran deep and strong." She moved among the flowers with practiced ease, her movements graceful and unhurried. Her hair caught the light in a way that made it seem part of the garden itself. There was something almost meditative about the way she worked, completely absorbed in the simple act of nurturing beauty. "She would have loved this time of morning," Violet continued, her voice soft with memory, "the way the light falls across the garden, the quiet before the world wakes up completely." She said that gardens taught patience, that the most beautiful things couldn't be rushed, only tended and trusted to bloom in their own time. Alina watched from a respectful distance, noting the way Violet's entire demeanor softened when she spoke of her mother. The carefully maintained composure she wore like armor in public fell away, revealing something genuine and vulnerable underneath. When Violet finished with the watering and turned to go back inside, she passed close to where Alina stood. Her steps slowed, then stopped altogether. "You have a loose shoelace," she observed, glancing down at Alina's boots. Before Alina could respond, Violet was kneeling gracefully, her fingers already working at the laces. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that Alina felt her breath catch. "Miss Violet, you don't need to." "Hold still," Violet murmured, her voice carrying gentle authority. Her touch was light, careful, as if she were handling something precious. The intimacy of the moment hit Alina like a physical blow. When had anyone last performed such a simple act of care for her? In the military, you took care of yourself, or you didn't survive. In her protection work, she was the one providing care, anticipating needs, ensuring safety. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such thoughtfulness. As Violet started to rise, Alina instinctively reached out to help her, their hands meeting in a brief electric contact. For a moment, they stood close enough that Alina could see the gold flecks in Violet's brown eyes, could smell the faint scent of violets that seemed to cling to her skin. Violet smiled, Not the carefully composed expression she wore for the world, but something radiant and unguarded. The morning light painted a soft halo around her face, and Alina felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been locked away for so long, she'd forgotten it existed. In Violet's world, most relationships were transactional. People were kind when they wanted something, respectful when it served their purposes. But there was nothing calculated in the way Violet treated her. No hidden agenda, no expectation of reciprocation. As they walked back toward the house, the morning sun climbing higher and warming the air around them, Alina found herself stealing glances at Violet. The simple cream dress, the way she moved with unconscious grace, the genuine smile that seemed to light up her entire face when she was happy. That evening, Alina was walking the halls when she heard it. A violin, soft and slow, threading through the quiet like a memory long buried. She followed it to a room she hadn't entered before. Through the slightly ajar door, she saw Violet, silhouetted in silver moonlight, standing by the tall windows, her bow moving with aching grace. The music was low, mournful, tender. Tears streaked Violet's cheeks, but she didn't stop. The final note quivered before dissolving into silence. Violet's arms fell slowly, as if waking from a dream. The room was dim, the only light coming from the open balcony where sheer curtains swayed with the night breeze. Moonlight touched everything with a soft, pale shimmer. The floor, the edges of a vanity, a vase of dried violets. Alina stepped forward, slow, careful. She held out a folded tissue. Violet took it, their fingers brushing. "Today would have been my mother's birthday," she said softly. This was her room. That song, it was hers. She turned toward the balcony. Outside, the garden lay cloaked in silver light. A gentle breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and Alina could see the tremble in her shoulders. Alina sat beside her. She didn't speak, didn't offer comfort wrapped in platitudes. She simply stayed. Violet didn't move away. If anything, she leaned slightly in Alina's direction, as though the silence between them was the only thing keeping her steady. The moonlight painted patterns across the wooden floor, long and gentle like threads of a lullaby. And Alina realized this was dangerous territory. Alina had been hired to protect Violet's body, to keep her safe from external threats. But somewhere between the carefully prepared breakfast and the violet-scented garden, between the gentle hands that had tended her wounds and the thoughtless kindness of tied shoelaces, she realized she was in danger of protecting something far more precious and fragile. She was beginning to care for Violet's heart, gently, irreversibly. And that, she realized, was the one assignment she hadn't been trained for, the one that could break her. Chapter 3. Freedom in Motion. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised them both. Violet had expected her temporary guardian to maintain the same distant professionalism as her previous bodyguards. Shadows that followed, at regulation distances, speaking only when spoken to, treating their assignment as exactly what it was, a job. But Alina was different in ways that Violet was only beginning to understand. Where Marcus had been content to wait in the car during Violet's music lessons, Alina positioned herself where she could observe both the entrances and Violet herself. Where her previous guards had treated her schedule as a series of security checkpoints to navigate, Alina seemed to genuinely listen when Violet spoke about her upcoming performances, her practice sessions, the pieces she was working to perfect. It wasn't intrusive attention. Alina never crossed the invisible line between professional and personal, but there was a quality of presence in her watchfulness that made Violet feel seen, rather than simply surveilled. The mansion, vast as it was, began to feel smaller with two people moving through its spaces in quiet synchronization. Violet would find herself pausing in doorways, listening for the soft sound of Alina's boots on marble, the subtle shift of fabric when she turned to scan a room. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the length of the conservatory or through the glass doors of the library, and something would pass between them. A recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of shared space and time. Violet had lived alone in the mansion's grandeur for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have another person's presence become part of the architecture of her days. Not the bustling efficiency of household staff, who came and went with their tasks, but someone whose job it was to notice her, to anticipate her movements, to exist in the orbit of her life. The realization came to her slowly. Despite having everything money could provide, she had been profoundly lonely. And now, for the first time in years, she wasn't. On a Thursday evening, as golden hour light streamed through the conservatory windows, Violet prepared for another performance. This one was smaller than the concert hall event where she and Alina had first met. An intimate gathering at a private venue downtown, the kind of performance that wealthy patrons commissioned to add cultural sophistication to their social calendars. "We should leave soon," Alina said from her usual position near the door. She was dressed in her standard uniform. Black suit perfectly tailored, white shirt crisp, dark tie knotted with military precision. But Violet had begun to notice the small details that made Alina uniquely herself. The way she unconsciously adjusted her cufflinks when she was thinking, the slight softening around her eyes when she thought no one was watching. "Actually," Violet said, "could we take your motorcycle tonight?" Alina's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Miss Violet, the car would be safer." "Please." The word came out smaller than Violet had intended, carrying more weight than a simple request. She stepped closer, her hands wrapping gently around Alina's. "Just once. I've always wondered what it would feel like." Alina hesitated. Violet looked up at her with wide, shimmering eyes. Her lips slightly parted in a pleading smile, an expression so innocent and unguarded it reminded Alina of a child begging for candy. Her hands gave a tiny shake, and something inside Alina wavered. "All right," Alina said, barely above a whisper. "Just this once." The smile that transformed Violet's face was worth every protocol they were about to break. That evening, the sun dipped low, casting the mansion in shades of rose gold and indigo. Alina waited outside by her motorcycle, a matte black vehicle that seemed to absorb the light around it. Violet emerged a few moments later, violin case in hand. She paused when she saw the bike, then broke into a grin that made Alina's breath catch. "You're serious?" Violet said, awe in her voice. Alina handed her a helmet. "Always." Violet took it reverently, then climbed on behind Alina, hesitating for a second before wrapping her arms securely around her waist. "Ready?" Alina asked. "As I'll ever be." Then Alina started the engine, and Violet's world shifted. The soft purr of the motorcycle turned into a low, steady growl beneath them, vibrating through Violet's spine and settling deep in her chest. As they pulled away from the mansion, the road stretched ahead like a ribbon of shadow and shimmer, lit by street lamps and neon signs that painted the city in hues of amber and violet. The night air wrapped around them like silk, cool and alive, and the world transformed into a blur of motion and sensation. Violet clung to Alina's waist, at first out of uncertainty, but soon with the trust of someone surrendering to something entirely new. Each turn they took drew a quiet laugh from her lips, not loud or showy, but genuine, the kind of sound that rarely escaped her in the structured confines of her usual life. The wind kissed her cheeks, teased strands of her hair from beneath the helmet, and rushed past them like a river of invisible freedom. She pressed closer to Alina, not out of fear, but because everything in her wanted to feel this fully. The city at this speed felt like a living thing, It wasn't a painting behind tinted windows anymore. It was vibrant, breathing, unpredictable. Streetlights streaked into golden halos as they passed, and the rush of wind made her eyes sting with something that felt suspiciously like happiness. Every scent, every sound, the sizzle of street food on corners, the murmur of music from open windows, the fragrance of jasmine in the evening air, felt heightened, immediate. Violet laughed again as they leaned into a curve, her body moving, in perfect tandem with Alina's. It felt instinctive, like a dance they'd always known, but had never practiced. She tightened her arms around Alina's waist, the contact steadying her, grounding her even as the rest of the world seemed to tilt around them. And in that moment, it hit her. This was freedom. Not the curated illusion she had grown up with. Gilded cages, chauffeured cars, meticulous schedules. Not the kind of freedom where every choice was already made for you by someone else's expectations. But real freedom, weaned in her face. The road uncharted. A woman who drove like she had nothing to lose, and someone worth protecting behind her. She exhaled softly and let herself lean forward, resting her cheek against Alina's back. There was strength there, solid, steady, but also warmth. Safety. Something unspoken but undeniably present. And it was beautiful. The performance venue turned out to be the rooftop terrace of an elegant hotel, strung with fairy lights that twinkled like earthbound stars. The audience was smaller than usual. Perhaps 30 people arranged in intimate clusters around cocktail tables, their conversation a gentle murmur beneath the city's distant hum. But Violet barely registered the familiar faces, the polite applause, the predictable compliments. She was still caught up in the lingering thrill of the ride, the memory of wind and speed and the solid warmth of Alina's presence. Her performance. That night had an edge it had never possessed before. Something wild and free that seemed to surprise even her. The music soared and dipped with new emotional depths, as if the motorcycle ride had unlocked something in her that had been waiting to be expressed. When the final note faded into the city night, the applause was more genuine than usual, less polite and more moved. Several people approached her afterward with comments that went beyond the standard pleasantries, speaking of the passion in her playing, the way the music had touched them. But all Violet could think about was the ride home. "Ready?" Alina asked, as they prepared to leave, and Violet nodded, perhaps more enthusiasm than the simple question warranted. This time, she settled onto the motorcycle with confidence, her arms finding their place around Alina's waist as if they belonged there. Instead of heading directly home, Alina took a longer route that wound along the river, past the twinkling lights of the waterfront district. They ended up at a night market near the harbour, a maze of food stalls and game booths and small carnival rides that Violet had only ever glimpsed from car windows. The air was thick with the scent of grilled meat and sugar and that indefinable mixture of humanity and possibility that marked places where people came to forget their everyday lives. "I've never been to anything like this," Violet admitted as they walked between the stalls, Alina maintaining her professional awareness while allowing herself to be drawn into Violet's obvious delight. They stopped at a photo booth, one of those old-fashioned machines that printed strips of black and white pictures. Violet pulled Alina inside with a laugh, insisting they needed to commemorate the evening. The space was cramped, forcing them to sit close together on the small bench. Through the first few flashes, they maintained appropriately formal expressions, but by the fourth shot, Violet was making faces at the camera with such determined silliness that even Alina's composed mask began to crack. The final picture caught them both laughing, Violet's head thrown back in genuine mirth, Alina's expression softer than it had been in any public moment since they'd met. They tried their luck at several game booths, Violet's attempts endearingly unsuccessful despite her obvious enjoyment. She couldn't hit the moving targets, couldn't land the rings on the bottles, couldn't knock down the weighted pins no matter how many times she tried. But she laughed at each failure, genuinely delighted by the experience itself rather than frustrated by her lack of success. Watching her, Alina felt something shift in her chest, a protective tenderness that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with the way Violet approached the world with such open-hearted enthusiasm despite all the disappointments it had given her. At the shooting gallery, Alina stepped forward. Her aim was perfect, as Violet had somehow known it would be. Shot after shot found its mark with mechanical precision, earning impressed murmurs from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. The prize she chose was a large stuffed bear, soft and cream-colored, with a red ribbon around its neck. She handed it to Violet without ceremony, but something in her expression made the simple gesture feel significant. "Thank you," Violet said, hugging the bear to her chest. No one had ever won her anything before. The gifts she received were usually expensive, carefully chosen to impress rather than delight. But this silly stuffed animal, won through skill and given freely, felt more precious than anything in her jewelry box. They ended up on the pedestrian bridge that spanned the river, leaning against the railing as the city lights reflected in the dark water below. "This is the first time I've ever been to a place like this," Violet said, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and sadness. "I always saw them from car windows and wondered what it would be like to just belong to it for a while." Alina was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you choose security work?" Violet asked eventually. "It seems like such a dangerous way to make a living." The question hung in the air between them, more personal than their usual conversations. "My family didn't have many options," Alina said. "The military provided structure, training, a way forward. After I left active duty, private security was a natural transition. It uses the same skills, pays well enough to help my sister through university." "You have a sister?" "Younger. She's studying engineering." There was pride in Alina's voice, carefully modulated but unmistakable. "She's brilliant, much smarter than I ever was." "And after she graduates?" Alina was quiet for so long that Violet thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, less guarded. "I'm going to open a cafe. Small, simple. Somewhere people can sit quietly, read books, watch the world go by. I've been saving for years." The image was so unexpected, so far from the dangerous precision Violet associated with Alina's current work, that it took her a moment to respond. "That sounds perfect," she said finally. "Peaceful. What about you?" Alina asked. "Is music what you always wanted to do?" Violet considered the question, absently stroking the bear's soft fur. "I love playing. It's the one thing that feels entirely mine, you know? That sometimes I wonder what it would be like to make music for people who chose to listen rather than people who attend, because it's socially expected." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the river and the distant sounds of the market. Violet shivered slightly, and without thinking, Alina shrugged out of her jacket and draped it around Violet's shoulders. The gesture was automatic, protective, but the moment Alina realized what she'd done, she felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. Violet pulled the jacket closer around herself, inhaling discreetly. It felt like being enveloped in safety, in care that came without expectation or agenda. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than they should have for such a simple courtesy. As the night grew later and the wind stronger, they made their way back to the motorcycle. But when Violet stood from the bridge railing, one of her heels caught in a gap between the concrete sections, and she stumbled. Alina caught her before she could fall, her arms coming around Violet's waist with instinctive protectiveness. For a moment they stood frozen, Violet's hands braced against Alina's shoulders, their faces closer than they had ever been. Violet could feel the warm puff of her breath. Something electric passed between them. Recognition, possibility, the acknowledgement of attraction that had been building beneath their carefully maintained professional distance. Then Alina stepped back, steadying Violet with gentle hands before kneeling to examine her broken heel. "I can't walk on this," Violet said, looking down at the damaged shoe with rueful amusement rather than frustration. Without a word, Alina rose and turned her back to Violet, crouching slightly. "Climb on." The piggyback ride to the motorcycle was perhaps the most intimate part of the entire evening. Violet's arms around Alina's neck, her legs around her waist, her cheek pressed against Alina's shoulder as they moved through the thinning crowd and down the path lined with cherry trees, whose blossoms drifted around them like snow. On the ride home, Violet held on even tighter than before, not from fear but from a reluctance to let the evening end. She could feel Alina's steady breathing, the controlled power in her movements as she navigated the quieter late-night streets. When they finally pulled into the mansion's garage, the silence felt different, charged with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge aloud. As they dismounted, Violet realized she was still wearing Alina's jacket. She started to remove it, but Alina shook her head. "Keep it tonight," Alina said quietly. "You can return it tomorrow." But even as she said it, both of them knew that something had shifted irrevocably. The professional distance they had maintained was no longer sustainable, not after a night of shared laughter and gentle gestures and moments of connection that had nothing to do with security protocols and everything to do with the recognition of kindred spirits finding each other in an unlikely place. As they walked to the house through the garden where violet flowers released their subtle fragrance into the night air, Violet clutched the stuffed bear in one arm and pulled Alina's jacket closer with the other. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to feel genuinely cared for by someone who expected nothing in return. And that realization was both thrilling and terrifying, because she could feel herself beginning to hope for something she had never dared to want before, the possibility of being loved for exactly who she was, rather than who she was supposed to be. Tomorrow, she would have to return the jacket and they would resume their professional roles. But tonight, wrapped in warmth and safety and something indefinably precious, Violet allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong to someone who saw her not as a responsibility or an opportunity, but as a person worth protecting simply because she mattered. And in the quiet of her room, as she hung Alina's jacket carefully in her closet and placed the stuffed bear on her pillow, she felt something stir within her, a tenderness that had nothing to do with duty or politeness. It crept in quietly, like the scent of violets after rain, and settled somewhere deep in her chest. Chapter 4. Behind the Masks. The grand ballroom of the Ashworth mansion sparkled under the crystal chandeliers, their light dancing across the polished marble floors and reflecting off the champagne glasses held by elegantly dressed guests. Violet stood at the top of the curved staircase, draped in a silken gown the color of twilight, her violet hair swept into an elegant twist that left her shoulders bare. Despite the luxurious setting, she felt like an actress preparing for a role she never auditioned for. "Remember, darling," her father had said earlier, adjusting his silver cufflinks, "tonight is about building connections. The Blackwood Corporation merger depends on these relationships." Now, as she descended the stairs with practiced grace, Violet caught sight of Alina positioned strategically near the entrance, dressed in her usual crisp white shirt and black vest, but somehow managing to look both professional and striking among the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Their eyes met briefly, and Violet felt a flutter of warmth in her chest. the only genuine feeling she'd experienced all evening. The party was in full swing, filled with her father's business associates and their families. Violet moved through the crowd like a well-trained diplomat, offering polite smiles and making pleasant conversation about topics that bored her to tears. She spoke of her violin performances, her charitable work, and her father's latest business ventures, all while feeling increasingly hollow inside. Alina maintained her professional distance, always within sight but never intrusive. However, her trained ears picked up conversations that made her jaw tighten with controlled anger. Near the ornate fireplace, two middle-aged men in expensive suits were deep in conversation, their voices carrying over the soft piano music. "So you're really going through with the Ashworth girl?" the first man asked, swirling his whiskey. "Of course," replied the second, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "She's the perfect investment. Pretty enough, well-connected, and completely naive. A few months of courtship, a proposal, and I'll have direct access to her father's empire." "And the girl herself?" The man shrugged dismissively. "Utterly boring. All she does is play that violin and tend to her mother's old garden. No personality, no fire." "But marriage isn't about passion. It's about portfolio expansion." Alina's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her training the only thing keeping her from crossing the room and showing these men exactly how much fire someone could have. Meanwhile, near the dessert table, a group of women in their 20s, daughters of other wealthy families, were engaged in their own cruel conversation. "Look at her," one of them whispered, nodding toward Violet, who was politely listening to an elderly businessman's story. "So serious all the time. Does she ever have fun? I heard she doesn't even have any real friends," another added with false sympathy. "Just sits in that big house all day playing music. How pathetic. My mother says she's probably going to end up like her mother. All that isolation can't be healthy," the third chimed in, causing the group to burst into barely concealed laughter. Violet, though she couldn't hear their exact words, noticed their glances and giggles. She'd grown accustomed to this treatment over the years, but it still stung. She excused herself from her conversation and walked toward the terrace doors, needing a moment of fresh air. The evening air was cool against her skin as she stepped onto the stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The party's noise became a muffled hum behind her, and for the first time that night she could breathe freely. "The stars are beautiful tonight," she said softly, not turning around, somehow knowing Alina had followed her. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Alina replied, her voice gentle but professional. "I'm not alone," Violet said, finally turning to face her guardian. "You're here." Before Alina could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of the terrace doors opening. A group of party guests had spilled outside, their laughter echoing in the night air. Among them was the man who had been discussing Violet earlier, now clearly intoxicated and emboldened by alcohol. "Violet," he called out, stumbling slightly as he approached. "There you are, hiding away from your own party." "Mr. Blackwood," Violet replied with forced politeness. "I was just getting some air." "Please call me James," he said, moving uncomfortably close. "We're going to be seeing a lot more of each other, aren't we?" Alina stepped slightly forward, her body language shifting to high alert, though she maintained her professional demeanor. "I should return to the party," Violet said, attempting to move past him, but James caught her arm. "Not so fast," he said with a grin that made Violet's skin crawl. "I've been trying to get you alone all evening. Your father and I have been discussing some arrangements." "I'm not sure what you mean," Violet replied, though a cold dread was settling in her stomach. "Don't play coy," James laughed. A merger between our families would be beneficial for everyone. And you, my dear, are exactly the kind of wife I need. Beautiful, well-bred, and best of all, manageable. The word manageable hung in the air like a slap. Violet felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. But before she could respond, the group behind James erupted in cruel laughter. Did you see her face? One of the women from earlier giggled. She actually thought someone might want her for herself. Honestly, James, you're practically doing charity work, another added. That's when disaster struck. Whether it was intentional or not, one of the women, the same one who had been making the cruelest comments, bumped into Violet as she tried to step back from James's advance. The collision sent Violet tumbling backward toward the swimming pool that bordered the terrace. The splash was loud enough to draw attention from inside the house. Violet, who had never learned to swim, panicked immediately. She thrashed helplessly, water filling her mouth. The water consumed her like silence, pulling her beneath its surface. Without hesitation, Alina dove into the pool fully clothed. Her combat boots and vest weighed her down, but her military training kicked in. She reached Violet in seconds, wrapping one strong arm around her waist and swimming toward the edge with powerful strokes. The crowd had gathered around the pool, some genuinely concerned, others merely entertained by the spectacle. The world broke open in a splash of air and light as Alina surged upward from the pool. Without a word to the gawking crowd, Alina scooped Violet into her arms, carrying her toward the house. Her jaw was set in determination, and her eyes held a fierce protectiveness that made even James Blackwood step aside. She carried Violet through the ballroom, past the shocked guests and up the grand staircase. Whispers followed in their wake, but Alina didn't care. Her only concern was the woman in her arms, who had wrapped her arms around Alina's neck and was pressing her face against her shoulder. Once in Violet's room, Alina gently set her down on the edge of the bed. "You need to get out of these wet clothes," she said practically, though her voice was softer now. "I'll get you something warm to wear, and then check on you in a few minutes." "Don't go," Violet whispered, her voice small and vulnerable. "Please." Alina's resolve wavered. She grabbed a plush robe from Violet's closet and handed it to her. "Change into this. I'll turn around." After Violet had changed, Alina excused herself briefly to change her own soaked clothes. When she returned, she found Violet sitting at her vanity, attempting to dry her hair with a towel, but her hands were shaking too much to be effective. "Here," Alina said quietly, taking the towel from her hands. "Let me." She began gently drying Violet's hair, her movements careful and methodical. The intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on either of them. In the mirror, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. "Why did you jump in after me?" Violet asked softly. Alina's hands stilled for a moment. "It's my job to protect you." "Is that the only reason?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Alina resumed drying her hair, but her touch had become even more gentle. "You matter," Alina said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than you know." Violet turned in her chair to face her, studying Alina's face in the soft lamplight. "Those people downstairs, they don't see me as a person, just as something to be used or mocked." "Then they're fools," Alina replied with quiet intensity. "They don't see your kindness, your talent, your strength. They don't see how you light up when you play violin, or how you worry about everyone but yourself. They don't see the real you." "Do you?" Violet asked, her voice trembling slightly. "See the real me?" Alina reached out, gently tucking a strand of damp hair behind Violet's ear. "I see someone extraordinary who's been told she's ordinary for so long that she started to believe it." I see someone who deserves so much more than what those people downstairs could ever offer." Tears welled up in Violet's eyes, but for once, they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of recognition. Someone finally saw her for who she truly was. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me tonight, in more ways than one." Alina smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Always," she said simply. Outside, the party continued, but neither of them cared. They had found something real in a world full of artificial smiles and empty promises. As Alina finished drying Violet's hair, both women knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The pretense of mere protector and protected was crumbling, replaced by something deeper, more dangerous, and infinitely more precious. The masks worn by the party guests downstairs weren't the only ones that had been removed that night. In the quiet sanctuary of Violet's room, two hearts had begun to reveal their true selves to each other. Later that night, the weather had taken a violent turn. Rain lashed against the mansion's windows with relentless fury, and thunder rolled across the sky like the footsteps of angry gods. Lightning illuminated the darkness in stark, terrifying flashes, followed by booming crashes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Alina lay in her room, but sleep eluded her. She found herself listening for any sound from Violet's room down the hall, a nagging worry gnawing at her chest. Something about the intensity of the storm made her restless, and her protective instincts were on high alert. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house, followed by a brilliant flash of lightning, Alina made her decision. She slipped out of bed, padding quietly down the hallway in her bare feet. The marble floor was cold beneath her feet, but she barely noticed. She paused outside Violet's door, listening. At first, she heard nothing over the storm's rage, but then, a soft sound that made her heart clench. Crying. Without hesitation, she turned the handle slowly. The room was dark except for the occasional lightning flash that cast eerie shadows across the walls. But in one of those brief moments of illumination, Alina saw her. Violet was curled up on her bed like a frightened child, her knees drawn up to her chest, both hands pressed tightly over her ears. Her eyes were squeezed shut and tears streamed down her cheeks. Her whole body trembled with each thunderclap, and soft whimpers escaped her lips. "Violet," Alina said softly, crossing the room quickly. She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart breaking at the sight of the strong, graceful woman reduced to such terror. "Why didn't you call for me?" Violet's eyes flew open at the sound of her voice, relief flooding her features, even as embarrassment colored her cheeks. I didn't want to disturb your rest," she whispered, her voice shaky. Alina felt something snap inside her chest, not anger at Violet, but a fierce, protective fury at the world that had taught this beautiful soul that her needs didn't matter, that she should suffer alone rather than ask for help. "You silly girl," Alina said, but her tone was gentle, loving even as she scolded. She reached out with tender hands to wipe the tears from Violet's cheeks. "Don't you understand? Taking care of you isn't work for me. It's what I want to do." Another crash of thunder made Violet flinch and whimper, instinctively pressing closer to Alina's warmth. "If you want," Alina said softly, "I can stay with you tonight. Would that help?" Violet looked up at her with wide, vulnerable eyes, her cheeks flushing pink with embarrassment and something deeper. "Could you?" she started, then stopped, biting her lip uncertainly. "What is it?" Alina encouraged gently. "Could you hold me?" Violet asked in barely a whisper, her face burning with shy embarrassment. Alina smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. Without saying anything, She gently stroked Violet's hair, then carefully climbed onto the bed. Beside her, she pulled Violet into her arms, drawing the soft blankets up around them both. Violet immediately melted into the embrace, her arms wrapping tightly around Alina's waist, as if she were a lifeline in a storm. She pressed her face against Alina's shoulder, breathing in her subtle scent, something clean and warm and uniquely her. "Better?" Alina asked quietly, one hand continuing to stroke Violet's hair, while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back. "Much better," Violet murmured against her shoulder, her voice already calmer. The thunder still raged outside, but somehow it seemed less frightening now. "Thank you." They lay there in comfortable silence, listening to each other's heartbeats instead of the storm. Alina's heart was beating fast, not from fear of the weather, but from the realization of how right this felt, how perfectly Violet fit in her arms, how desperately she wanted to protect this woman from every storm, both literal and metaphorical. Violet's heart was racing too, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. It was from the overwhelming sense of safety and belonging she felt in Alina's embrace. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly protected, truly cared for. As the storm gradually began to subside and exhaustion finally claimed them both, they remained intertwined, two hearts finding solace in each other's rhythm. Neither spoke of what this meant, of the lines they were crossing, of the impossible situation they were creating. For now, it was enough to simply be together, to offer and accept comfort, to acknowledge without words that something profound was blooming between them, something as beautiful and unstoppable as the violet flowers in the garden, and just as fragile in a world that might not understand. Chapter 5. The Song of Farewell. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of Violet's room, casting a golden glow across the two women still wrapped in each other's arms. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air and a sense of peace that neither had felt in a long time. Violet was the first to wake, her eyes fluttering open to find herself pressed against Alina's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in this perfect bubble of warmth and safety, memorizing every detail, the way Alina's breathing was deep, and even the protective way her arms encircled her, the subtle scent of her skin. When Alina stirred, Violet quickly closed her eyes, not ready for this moment to end. She felt Alina's hand gently stroke her hair, and it took all her willpower not to purr like a contented cat. "I know you're awake," Alina said softly, her voice husky with sleep and tinged with gentle amusement. Violet's cheeks flushed as she opened her eyes, looking up to meet Alina's gaze. "Good morning," she whispered, suddenly shy. "Good morning," Alina replied, her hand still threading through Violet's hair. "How do you feel?" "Safe," Violet answered without hesitation, then blushed deeper at her own honesty. "Thank you for staying with me." Something flickered in Alina's eyes, an emotion too complex to name. "Always," she said, the word carrying more weight than a simple promise. The spell was broken by a gentle knock on the door. "Miss Violet?" came the voice of the housekeeper. "Your father called. He won't be home for dinner, but he reminded me about your performance tonight." Reality crashed back in, and both women quickly separated, the professional distance returning like a protective shield. That something had changed between them. An invisible thread had been woven during the night, connecting their hearts in a way that couldn't be undone. The concert hall buzzed with anticipation as the evening's audience took their seats. It was one of the city's most prestigious venues, and tonight's performance was a charity gala for children's music education, a cause close to Violet's heart. Backstage, Violet stood before her dressing room mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to fasten her necklace. She wore a stunning midnight blue gown that complemented her violet hair, which was styled in an elegant updo with a few loose tendrils framing her face. "Here," Alina said quietly, appearing behind her. "Let me help." Their fingers brushed as Alina took the delicate chain, and both women felt an electric shock at the contact. Alina's movements were gentle and precise as she fastened the necklace, her fingers barely grazing the soft skin of Violet's neck. In the mirror, their eyes met, and the air between them crackled with unspoken emotions. "You look beautiful," Alina said softly, her hands resting lightly on Violet's shoulders. "Thank you," Violet whispered, her heart racing. "Alina, 5 minutes, Miss Ashworth," called the stage manager, interrupting the moment. Violet nodded, taking a deep breath to center herself. She picked up her violin case, her most precious possession, a beautiful instrument that had belonged to her mother. "This performance," she said, turning to face Alina, "it's special. The piece I'm playing, it's for someone who changed my life. Someone who appeared like an angel when I needed protection most." Alina's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, to tell Violet how much she meant to her, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the depth of emotion in her dark eyes. "I'll be watching from the wings," Alina said. "You'll be magnificent." As Violet walked onto the stage, the audience fell silent. She was radiant under the stage lights, her gown shimmering like starlight, her violin gleaming gold. She positioned herself at the center of the stage, her posture perfect, her expression serene. From her position in the wings, Alina watched with rapt attention. She had seen Violet practice countless times, but there was something different about her tonight. A glow, a presence that commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Violet's voice carried clearly through the hall, "tonight I would like to share with you a piece that holds special meaning for me. It's a composition I wrote myself, titled Guardian Angel. It's dedicated to someone who taught me that protection isn't just about keeping someone safe from harm. It's about showing them they're worthy of being protected, worthy of being cared for." Alina's heart clenched as Violet's words washed over her. She knew, somehow, she knew this was for her. Violet raised her violin to her shoulder, closed her eyes, and began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, like a bird testing its wings. The melody spoke of loneliness, of a soul trapped in a beautiful cage, yearning for freedom. But then the music began to change, growing stronger, more confident. New harmonies emerged, weaving together in a dance of hope and discovery. As Violet played, her entire being seemed to merge with the music. Her movements were graceful and fluid, her expression one of pure emotion. The audience was mesmerized, but she was playing for an audience of one. The woman standing in the shadows, watching with tears in her eyes. The melody told their story without words. The first meeting, the tentative trust, the gradual blooming of something beautiful and unexpected. There were passages of tenderness, of shared laughter, of quiet moments in gardens and on motorcycle rides. There were darker themes too, the fear, the danger, the realization that their time together was limited. But underlying it all was love. Pure, honest, overwhelming love that couldn't be contained or denied any longer. Alina pressed her hand to her chest, feeling as if her heart might burst. She had never been serenaded before, had never been the subject of such beautiful music. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she finally admitted to herself what she had been fighting for weeks. She was completely, irrevocably in love with Violet Ashworth, and in that moment, she also realized the cruel irony of their situation. She was a temporary employee, a guardian assigned to protect someone she could never have. Violet deserved someone who could match her station, someone who could give her the life she deserved. Not a former soldier with a complicated past and an uncertain future. The music reached its crescendo, soaring and triumphant, speaking of love that conquered fear, of finding light in darkness. But then, gradually, it began to fade, growing softer and more melancholy, as if the melody itself knew that some beautiful things were destined to be temporary. As the last note faded into silence, the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Violet opened her eyes, immediately seeking Alina's gaze across the distance. When their eyes met, something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a confession, a goodbye all rolled into one. The ride home was quiet, both women lost in their own thoughts. Violet sat behind Alina on the motorcycle, her arms wrapped tightly around her guardian's waist, wishing desperately that this road could stretch on forever. The wind whipped through their hair as they rode through the city streets, past the twinkling lights and the late-night crowds. Violet pressed her cheek against Alina's back, memorizing the feeling of being this close to her, of sharing this moment of freedom together. When they finally pulled into the mansion's driveway, neither moved immediately. They sat in the silence, both knowing that stepping off this motorcycle meant returning to reality, a reality where tomorrow would bring an end to their time together. "Alina," Violet said softly, her voice barely audible over the settling engine. "Yes? Could you take me for rides sometimes? After tomorrow, I mean. Just to feel the wind again." Alina's hands tightened on the handlebars. "Of course," she said, though her voice was rough with emotion. They walked to the front door together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. At the threshold, they paused, both reluctant to cross into the house where they would have to say goodbye. "Thank you," Violet said, turning to face Alina. "For everything. For protecting me, for caring about me, for seeing me." Alina stepped closer, her usual professional distance forgotten. "Violet, I know," Violet interrupted gently. "I know we can't. I know this is goodbye." "It doesn't have to be goodbye forever," Alina said, cupping Violet's face gently in her hands. "I meant what I said about the motorcycle rides." Violet leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "I'm going to miss you so much." "And I'm going to miss you," Alina whispered, leaning down to press a soft kiss to Violet's forehead. "More than you know." She pulled Violet into her arms then, holding her tightly against her chest. They stood there in the doorway, neither wanting to be the first to let go, both trying to memorize the feeling of being in each other's arms. "Take care of yourself," Alina whispered into her hair. Finally, reluctantly, they separated. Alina walked to her motorcycle, her steps heavy with the weight of leaving. She started the engine, the sound loud in the quiet night. As she drove away, Violet stood in the doorway watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did she allow herself to cry, her tears falling like rain on the steps of her beautiful empty house. In the silence of her empty house, Alina's presence was already a memory, but the love she had awakened in Violet's heart would bloom eternal, like the violet flowers in her mother's garden, beautiful and enduring, waiting for the right season to bloom again. Chapter 6. When Violet blooms. The days without Alina felt like living in grayscale. Violet found herself staring at empty spaces where Alina used to stand, by the kitchen counter where she'd pull out chairs, near the front door where she'd wait patiently, in the garden where she'd watch Violet tend to the violet flowers with those steady, protective eyes. 3 weeks had passed since their last ride together, and Violet's upcoming performance felt different this time. She had poured all her longing, all her unspoken words into the piece she would play. A melody that spoke of love discovered too. Late, of hearts that beat in sync despite the distance between them. "I want to give you tickets to my performance," Violet had said when she called Alina, her voice trembling slightly. It's important to me that you're there." Alina's warm voice had carried through the phone. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Violet." They agreed to meet at the small cafe near the concert hall. Violet arrived early, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the envelope containing the tickets. She wore a simple lavender dress, her purple hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the cafe windows. But as minutes turned to an hour, then 2, Alina never appeared. Violet's phone buzzed. Her heart leaped, expecting Alina's apology for being late, but instead, an unknown number flashed on her screen. "Miss Violet," a gruff voice spoke when she answered. "If you want to see your bodyguard friend again, you'll come alone to the old warehouse on Pier 47. You have 1 hour." The line went dead. Fear coursed through Violet's veins, but beneath it burned something fiercer: determination. Alina had risked everything to protect her before, and now it was Violet's turn to be brave. The warehouse loomed dark and imposing against the evening sky. Violet's hands shook as she pushed open the heavy metal door, stepping into the dim, echoing space. Her footsteps seemed to thunder in the silence. "Alina?" she called out, her voice small in the vast emptiness. A harsh laugh echoed from the shadows. "Look what we have here. The little princess came to play hero." Several figures emerged from behind stacked crates and machinery. Violet recognized the leader, one of the men from the first kidnapping attempt. His face bore fresh scars and his eyes held a vengeful gleam. "Where is she?" Violet demanded, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You'll see her soon enough." He nodded to his men. "Take her." As rough hands reached for her, a familiar voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't touch her." Alina stepped out of the shadows, her clothes torn and bloodied, her hands bound behind her back. Even restrained and injured, she radiated a dangerous calm that made the kidnappers hesitate. "Alina." Violet's relief was palpable, but it quickly turned to horror as she saw the extent of Alina's injuries. "I told you to come alone," the leader snarled, pulling out a knife and pressing it to Alina's throat. "She did come alone," Alina said quietly, her eyes never leaving Violet's face. "I've been here for hours. You think I wouldn't have backup plans?" As if summoned by her words, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The leader's face contorted with rage. "You little..." He raised the knife. But Alina was faster. Even with her hands bound, she twisted away and drove her shoulder into his stomach, sending them both tumbling to the ground. Chaos erupted. The other kidnappers rushed forward, but Alina fought with desperate fury, even with her restraints. Violet watched in terror as Alina took blow after blow, her movements growing slower, more labored. When one of the men raised a crowbar above Alina's prone form, Violet didn't think, she just moved. The heavy tool caught her across the shoulder, sending her crashing to the concrete floor. "Violet!" Alina's anguished cry seemed to give her new strength. She snapped her restraints through sheer force of will and launched herself at Violet's attacker. The police burst through the doors just as one of the kidnappers, desperate and cornered, pulled out a knife and lunged at Violet. Alina threw herself between them, the blade finding its mark in her abdomen. Time seemed to stop. Alina collapsed to her knees, her hand pressed to the wound as blood seeped between her fingers. Violet crawled to her side, tears streaming down her face. "Alina, no." Violet pressed her hands over Alina's, trying to stop the bleeding. Help! Someone help us! Alina's face was pale but peaceful as she looked up at Violet. You are the most precious thing in my life, she whispered, her voice growing faint. I will always protect you. Please don't leave me, Violet sobbed, leaning down to press her forehead against Alina's. I need you. I love you. With trembling hands, Violet cupped Alina's face and kissed her, tasting salt from their mingled tears. It was a kiss full of everything they'd never said. All the moments they'd shared. All the tomorrows they might never have. Alina's eyes fluttered closed, and her body went limp in Violet's arms. No! Violet's scream echoed through the warehouse as paramedics rushed in, their urgent voices a blur around her. Don't leave me. Please. 1 year later, the morning mist clung to the cemetery grounds as Violet knelt beside a simple gravestone, placing a bouquet of fresh violets at its base. The inscription read, Rosemary Ashworth, beloved mother, your music lives on in those you loved. Hi, Mom, Violet whispered. I have so much to tell you. About Alina, about everything that's happened. I think you would have loved her, Mum. She's strong and gentle and brave, just like you always told me to be. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. I was so scared I'd lost her. Violet continued, her voice breaking slightly. For months I thought, but she's stubborn, Mom. Just like you said I was. She laughed through her tears. The doctors said it was a miracle she survived. But I know better. She had something to live for. Footsteps approached on the gravel. Path behind her. Violet smiled without turning around as a familiar warmth settled around her shoulders. Alina's jacket, still carrying her subtle scent. You're going to catch cold, Alina said softly, settling beside Violet on the grass. Her movements were still careful, protecting the scar that ran across her abdomen, but her eyes were bright and full of life. Violet leaned into Alina's side, feeling complete for the first time in months. Mum, she said, addressing the gravestone. I want you to meet someone very important to me. This is Alina, the woman who saved my life in every way a person can be saved. Alina's arm tightened, around Violet's shoulders. She'd been nervous about this visit, about meeting the memory of the woman who had shaped Violet into the extraordinary person she'd fallen in love with. She loves music just like you did, Violet continued. And she takes care of me, even when I'm being stubborn about it. She makes me laugh, and she makes me feel safe. And she loves me with everything she has. Mrs. Ashworth, Alina said quietly, surprising Violet by addressing the gravestone directly. I'd promised to love and protect your daughter with my life. She's taught me what it means to truly live, not just survive. I'll make sure she knows every day how precious she is. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning sun burn away the mist. Finally, Violet stood, brushing grass from her dress. We should go, she said, taking Alina's hand and helping her to her feet. The cafe opens in an hour, and you know how nervous you get before the morning rush. Alina's coffee shop, Violet's Garden, had opened 6 months ago in a cozy corner building downtown. It featured live music on weekend evenings, usually Violet on violin, sometimes joined by local musicians Alina had befriended. The walls were painted in soft pastels and decorated with photographs of violet flowers from Violet's garden. As they walked toward Alina's motorcycle, Violet stopped suddenly and turned to face her. What is it? Alina asked, concerned. Violet reached up to cup Alina's face, her thumb tracing a small scar on her cheekbone, a reminder of that terrifying night that had changed everything. I just want you to know, Violet said softly, that you're my home now. Not the mansion. Not anywhere else, just you. Alina's smile was radiant as she leaned down to kiss Violet, soft and sweet and full of promise. "And you're mine," she murmured against Violet's lips. "My Violet, blooming in all seasons." They climbed onto the motorcycle, Violet's arms wrapping securely around Alina's waist. As they rode through the awakening city, the morning sun painting everything in shades of gold, Violet pressed her cheek against Alina's back and smiled. She had found her freedom, not in running away from her gilded cage, but in opening her heart to love. And in Alina's steady presence, her quiet strength, her unwavering devotion, Violet had discovered something her money could never buy. A love that would last forever. The violet flowers in her garden would bloom again come spring, but the love between them would never fade. It would only grow stronger, deeper, more beautiful with each passing day. As they pulled up to the cafe, customers already waiting outside for their morning coffee, Violet couldn't help but laugh with pure joy. This was her life now, messy and imperfect and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. "Ready for another day?" Alina asked as they climbed off the bike. Violet took her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "With you? I'm ready for forever." And as they walked into their little cafe together, the morning light streaming through the windows and catching in Violet's purple hair like trapped starlight, both women knew that their love story was just beginning. The girl who had once lived like a bird in a golden cage now soared free, her heart finally at peace in the arms of the woman who had shown her that true freedom comes from choosing to love someone completely, to build a life together, to bloom together like violets in an endless spring. Thank you for listening to this gentle love story. If it brought you a moment of warmth or peace, my heart is happy. Until we meet again, stay kind, stay soft, and keep believing in love. And remember, you deserve a love as deep and true as the one we just shared, because your heart, with all its beautiful imperfections, is meant to be cherished.